just in relation to my topic today is unlicensed medicines and off-label use of medicines in palliative care, as Michael said. So firstly, an overview. I'm going to just define some of the terminology around unlicensed medicines and off-label medicines use. Firstly, I'll look at exempt medicinal products and what they are, and the legislation and guidance around those, and what our local policy is and the Irish context, and just give us, a look at some examples of EMPs in use in palliative care. And then secondly, we'll focus in on the off-label use of medicines and, how that applies in palliative care, but also looking at what the professional bodies are saying, what the regulators are saying, and the various position statements on unlicensed use of medicines. And then just a quick look at off-label use in the media. And then just at the end, we'll summarize and see where we're at with the off-label use in palliative care, and we'll discuss some future steps as well. So firstly, unlicensed or unauthorized medicines. These are exempt medicinal products as per Irish legislation. So an exempt medicinal product is a medicinal product which does not carry either a product authorization number issued by the HPRA or a marketing authorization number issued by the European Medicines Agency. But it's considered exempt because it's legally allowed to be supplied to the order of a registered practitioner for use by a patient under his or her direct care. So this is defined in the medicinal products regulations, and it's talking about medicines that are unauthorized, but they can legally be used because of this exemption, and hence the name exempt medicinal products. It also includes things like investigational drugs in registered clinical trials, and medicines that have no marketing authorization because they're manufactured as a special item individually for a patient, and they would be subject then to good manufacturing practice standards. So the medicines, just to quickly look at the medicines authorization process, it's led by the pharmaceutical company who seeks approval for the product. And that approval is either directly the national procedures through the HPRA in Ireland, or the centralized procedure where the EMA approves the drug. And this is mandatory for certain types of drugs, such as cancer treatments, diabetes treatments, and high biotechnology drugs, such as things like vaccines and certain other treatments for rare conditions. Then the other EU approval process is a decentralized process where approval can just be sought in one or more member state. And then finally, there's the approval process through mutual recognition between countries. So where one country has a marketing authorization for a drug, another country can agree to mutually recognize marketing authorizations of that country. So just to get a background on that. So then once medicines are authorized, they're authorized in accordance with a specific license for use, and that's detailed in the summary of product characteristics. So this document is available for every licensed medicine on the HPRA website or the EMA website. And there's also a UK website for UK licensed medicines. So exempt medicinal products, what does the HPRA say about these? So they say they may not be prescribed or supplied in situations where there is an authorized equivalent available in Ireland. And they also stipulate that the pharmacist and the wholesaler need to be, aware where there's just a short-term supply of an unlicensed medicine to fill in a gap where there's a shortage of a licensed product, that we need to be on top of getting back in the licensed product as soon as that's available. And it's essential, they say, that all practitioners in the supply chain understand that EMPs have not been assessed by the HPRA against the criteria of safety, quality, and efficacy, and the responsibility for clinical use lies with the prescriber. So, while that sounds sort of hefty, I suppose, we know that when we're procuring drugs that, they're probably licensed in a nearby country, the UK or a European country. Sometimes we have to go further afield, but I suppose we hopefully, rely on the fact that the criteria, the safety criteria and the quality criteria in those countries would be similar to our own. And they warn that attention especially is needed regarding, potential allergens where you're switching from a product to an unlicensed product, different expressions of strength that exist in different countries, where there's a different expression of a drug, a salt form of a drug. And we've seen that happen with switching products before. And a key thing is that the labeling may not be in English and the patient information may not be in English. So I suppose looking at why we have so many EMPs in use in Ireland, again, I suppose it's our small market. The marketing authorization processes are time consuming, they're expensive, and it sometimes the cost of marketing a product here just doesn't, just doesn't justify it in terms of financial benefit. And even where marketing the medicine may be profitable, sometimes the legislation that allows us to use EMPs, it doesn't really incentivize companies to seek a product authorization or to seek an extension of their license to include uses that are, in common practice. Certainly, in terms of drug availability and EMPs, things like the central EMA processes have helped, I suppose, small countries like Ireland. But then Brexit also brings some uncertainty to supply chains, I think, and that's still to be played out, I think, in the next few years. So here in Our Lady's Hospice and Care Services, what is our policy on exempt medicinal products? So the DTC approves the list of regularly prescribed EMPs, and this is circulated to prescribers annually, and then we circulate changes quarterly. There's an approved list available to view internally on our staff portal, and we also developed a patient information leaflet on EMPs, and I'll give you a look at that. So this was an answer to guidance from the Pharmaceutical Society that all patients should be made aware when they're supplied an exempt product that that it's not a licensed product. Sorry, skipping back there a bit. Skipping forward a little bit. So that again is on the pharmacy homepage, but it's I suppose challenging sometimes to see where best to use that and what the information needs of patients are around this, and it's complex to explain. But certainly where a patient has a request for more information, that's there as a support. And then just looking at the availability and access and safety issues with EMPs. So EMPs are generally not covered on the community drug schemes, unfortunately, with a few limited exceptions. So this means that everybody in the community who needs to be prescribed an EMP, needs to get hardship scheme or essential non-GMS scheme approval. And pharmacies report problems with that scheme sometimes in getting their payments, and as a result, some pharmacies are just not participating in that scheme. So on occasions, it may be difficult for a patient in the community to access an exempt medicinal product. Again, some of the challenges are the foreign language packaging and the patient information leaflets. And in the hospital setting, we're frequently having to switch out different EMPs, and we need to just, I guess, where we're using those EMPs in an off-label way, we can't be sure that they're certain to be interchangeable with the previous product that we've had. So we just need to be very careful with the foreign language packaging, and that the medicine selection process will be safe at ward level, but also just that things like compatibility of injectables, that when we're switching products, that we have a robust process to assess any new product that comes in, which is an EMP. And then just having a quick look at some of the examples of EMPs that we use commonly in palliative care. So we have our alfentanil at the higher strength is unlicensed, docosate capsules, haloperidol, amitriptyline, BMX we know is a special, glycopyrrolate, and the list goes on. So, as you can see there, I suppose quite a wide range of our commonly used medicines are not licensed in this country. Regulation of EMPs, the Pharmaceutical Society guides pharmacists on the legal requirements, and there are some particular legal requirements in terms of the procurement and record keeping, and they mandate that patients are appropriately informed of unauthorized or exempt status of medicinal product, and records are kept of that information that's been given to the patient. So I suppose, again, that's maybe more realistic in the outpatient setting where patients are stable, a bit more difficult to comply with, I think, in very unwell patients in the inpatient setting. So then moving on then to off-label or unlicensed use of medicines. And I think it's hard to look at this without having had an introduction to look at the exempt products. This is any use of a medicine which is not in accordance with its license. So prescribing of a medicine in a way that is not described in its summary of product characteristics. And, you know, in general, when I'm speaking about that in this presentation, we may be talking about a summary of product characteristics from another jurisdiction because we might not always have the license here in Ireland. A quick snapshot of, you know, off-label use in palliative care. It's broad. You know, we know that we use a lot of medicines off-label in palliative care, but I suppose it's also broad in the sense that it's off-label in a number of different ways. So it's not just that we're using something for a different indication, but we're also maybe using it in a different population, or, you know, we're using it via a different route, I think, quite commonly. And I think like a key consideration is that when you look at the range of things that are used off-label and the range of ways we use medicines off-label, you know, it ranges from sort of very standard routine practice, like our syringe drivers, that, you know, it's internationally accepted that this is, you know, an essential part of our symptom management, down to kind of more niche things where, you know, it's a small study or a few small studies that support the use of a drug for symptom management. And, you know, again, I think that's a key consideration for us when using those medicines and when balancing the risk benefit for patients, and also when deciding whether it's important to inform the patient, I guess, that the use is off-label. So I could run through some of those, but it's quite a busy slide. I think, you know, you can see some of the things there, like we use alfentanil for cancer pain. Its licenses for an analgesic for induction of anesthesia. We use Bucalam, you know, for a variety of things. It's licensed in pediatrics, a different population, and for seizures. Even when we use NSAIDs for bone pain, I guess it's an off-label indication, but then we give them subcutaneously, which is also off-label. We might use doses beyond the licensed use. We might use antipsychotics for some antipsychotics. Many of them are not licensed for delirium or for insomnia, where we might use them. Yeah, the list goes on. So I suppose it seems like we almost use everything off-label in palliative care, but I think we're not alone in that. And I think, you know, I suppose there are often, like, I suppose in areas like oncology, patients might be used to the concept of off-label use, and they may well, you know, they may well be familiar with, you know, where new evidence has come along and it lags behind the licensing process for new medicines in particular. And, you know, they may have been offered treatments off-label. So I guess it's not, you know, we're not totally unique, except I suppose we're often using older medicines. It tends to be older medicines that we're using in palliative care. And I think, you know, that's an important point, that like we see it in other disciplines where it would actually possibly be unethical not to use the off-label use of that medicine once the evidence comes along to tell us that there is a you know, substantial benefit for the patient. So then, just I suppose in summary, we know then that it's a specialty where off-label use is extremely common and essential. And you know, I guess the difference here in Ireland is that often when we're using medicines off-label, we're also potentially using a medicinal product which is unlicensed or doesn't carry a marketing authorization here. So, so what is the legal position here then? Off-label prescribing, according to the European Court of Justice, is not prohibited or even regulated by EU law. There's no provision which prevents doctors from prescribing a medicinal product for a therapeutic indication other than those for which a marketing authorization has been granted. And there's no specific provision in Irish law either to prevent or support off-label use of the medicine, and it's considered to be common practice. There is legislation, however, around marketing and advertising medicines by the pharmaceutical company, so that, you know, it's illegal for them to market anything or to advertise anything for an off-label use of their medicine. And just looking quickly at what regulatory bodies say, the EMA does not regulate off-label prescribing, but they do make attempts to monitor the safety of off-label uses. Other European member states, some states have tried to regulate and restrict off-label prescribing. I know France has a system of, you know, registering off-label uses. Over in the States, the FDA is supportive of off-label prescribing, very much supportive of it, and but they do place, they do emphasize the responsibility of the physician to be well informed about the product and to, be aware of the scientific rationale behind their prescribing decisions. Again, the AMA, supporting the preservation of autonomous clinical decision-making of physicians and their entitlement to use FDA-approved products in an unlabeled indication. Here in Ireland, the National Midwifery Board of Ireland looks at, how, I suppose, approval of registered nurse prescribers, and they have clearly stated that there's no impediment in the relevant legislation or professional regulation to an RNP or midwife prescriber to prescribe a medicinal product for off-label use. So again, they just stipulate being aware of best practice and local policies and procedures, and being knowledgeable again around whether there is an available authorized medicinal product that could be prescribed in the case of EMPs, and just to be clear that the drug they're using is commonly used in their area of practice, so it must be within their scope of practice. Over in the UK, the General Medical Council did give some specific guidance on use of unlicensed medicines, and they said that it may be necessary under certain circumstances where there's no suitably licensed medicine, or there's one that there isn't an available medicine. Jumping ahead there again. Or the prescribing forms part of a properly approved research project. So they also spoke, or they also give guidance in their document about informing patients about the license for their medicine, and they give some detail on, how much we need to do this, and they have acknowledged that in emergencies there may not be a realistic alternative, and that it's not practical or necessary to draw attention to the license. But in other cases, it may be appropriate to explain to the patient why we're using something off license. I should say that I didn't really include anything on the Irish Medical Council because they don't specifically give guidance on off-label medicines use. And I suppose what I would take from that is that I guess their guidance on prescribing is, implicitly kind of considers that as it's the same whether you're giving, whether you're considering a decision to prescribe on label or off label. So I mean, same sort of considerations about risk, benefit, and what the information needs of the patient are. So then just looking at position statements on off-label medicines, and the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health looked at the use of unlicensed medicines or licensed medicines for unlicensed applications in paediatric practice, and also the British Pain Society, in collaboration with the Association for Palliative Medicine in the UK, looked at a joint statement on unlicensed medicines. So just quickly to look at that. They talked about unlicensed medicine use being both a necessary, common and legitimate aspect of clinical practice, and up to 25% of all prescription in palliative care were off license. They pointed to the specialized texts that highlight our use of off-label medicines, and they pointed out that it can be very difficult to identify every instance of off-label use because it's so broad, and because off-label use can mean anything, can mean so much once you're not complying with the SPC in full. They did say that healthcare professionals should inform, change and monitor their practice with regard to medicines beyond the marketing authorization in light of evidence from audit and published research. So I guess keeping up to date and changing practice as required. They talked about the responsibility lying with the prescriber, and being able to be fully informed and balance the potential good and the potential harm. They did also say that it may not be necessary to draw attention to meds routinely used off-label when discussing this with patients, and sometimes a detailed explanation could be impractical, burdensome, and even result in refusal of treatment. Over in the UK, also the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health stated that the use of unlicensed medicines or using medicines for unlicensed applications was necessary in pediatric practice, and they pointed to the BNF for children as a resource providing reliable information. And again, they said that it was generally not necessary to take additional steps beyond those when prescribing licensed medicines to obtain consent from guardians and parents and child patients. Now to just quickly look at off-label prescribing in the media. So sometimes, off-label use has received, negative media attention. And I just highlight this article from the Irish Times where there's a heading saying use of off-label medicines puts patient safety at risk. And I suppose that statement on its own is, can be alarming for patients. And I think the article, when you read on about it, really it was the patient selection. It was a commonly used off-label use of a medicine. But, it was the patient selection that was wrong, and that patient shouldn't have been chosen for that medicine. But I suppose, whether it was licensed or not, that the licensing issue wasn't really that relevant. But I think, that the headline, again, was about the fact that the medicine was used off-label. In the US, often the media attention is around the pharmaceutical companies illegally marketing off-label uses of their medicines. So here's a headline from the Washington Post about Seroquel or quetiapine, which was heavily marketed for insomnia in the US. And, huge profits were made just from this use of the medicine, where its, license would be much more narrow, and it would be for schizophrenia and for bipolar disorder. And then the long-running saga of Avastin use in wet age-related macular degeneration, which is an off-label use of that drug. And I suppose initially it began because there wasn't an available product licensed for this condition for wet AMD. And then even when the drugs became available and were marketed especially for this use, people continued to use Avastin bevacizumab because it was cheaper. And currently there are pharmaceutical companies challenging this use in the courts in the NHS policy to continue to use the unlicensed product, the off-label product when there are products available. And in March 2020, a UK Court of Appeal upheld a ruling that Avastin bevacizumab could be used off-label for wet AMD to save NHS costs, but they imposed stricter safety and patient consent measures. And I think this was kind of an interesting change in direction, because in the past, EU rulings were consistently saying that, use of medicines off-label should be for clinical benefit reasons and not for financial reasons. So it's a change in direction there, and also an interesting emphasis again on, maybe in more enforcing more rigid safety and, patient information controls around off-label use. So then just looking at the potential negatives of off-label use, there will be more limited information, or at least it's more difficult to access information on the benefit-risk balance, and there's a poor evidence base usually for off-label use. The liability for off-label use is a little less clear. It's difficult to monitor adverse effects because we won't, they won't be collated for that indication so much. Even if we're reporting in adverse effects centrally, they're not going to collate the adverse effects for that off-label use of the medicine. It may undermine the marketing authorization process, probably not so much for the older medicines that we use in palliative care, but I guess in the case of Avastin, for example, it probably did undermine, or at least, delay the marketing authorization process, or make it less potentially profitable anyway, I think, for companies looking to market a licensed drug. It could potentially discourage research and development, but looking at it in a different way, I think it could also help us in palliative care to identify areas for future research. And at patient level, as I mentioned, our patient information leaflets, if we're using the medicine in an off-label way, they'll be unsuitable and they won't be tailored to that off-label use, and they could cause confusion. And the negative media coverage, may give rise to patient concern when that occurs. Oops. So this slide didn't seem to come up properly, but I had a really nice diagram there looking at, okay, I seem to have lost the diagram. But anyway, looking at the patient, the illness, the evidence, and the harms. Not sure why that didn't share properly. So this, I just thought it was an interesting way to look at that, the considerations that are made every day when decisions around treatments are made, both for licensed and both for off-label and licensed uses of medicines. And I think it sort of shows that, you know, at the top, you know, the kind of low risk, you know, areas, you know, where the patient has, you know, characteristics that aren't high risk, where the illness is severe, where the harm is likely to be low, and where the evidence is high. But I suppose there's a whole continuum in each of those, where the patient may be more vulnerable to adverse effects, the illness may be more trivial, and so the risk of you know, introducing a medicine is greater, and down to where the evidence is very poor, and potentially the harms from the medicine could be, you know, we know that it's a medicine that's associated with adverse effects. So it was just an interesting way of thinking about that prescribing, you know, that kind of decision-making consideration. But sorry about that, that seemed to go missing. Looked fine on the PowerPoint. Anyway, so I suppose in summary, EMP and off-label prescribing as it applies to palliative care, where are we at? So in palliative care practice, we use medicines in an off-label manner routinely, and we often use medicines which are exempt medicinal products. And this really forms an essential part of the care of our patients. We know that the use of EMPs in palliative care usually relates to the use of older medicines rather than the new investigational medicines. And often these medicines were previously licensed products in Ireland. When we use medicines in an off-label way in palliative care, you know, often it's in accordance with widely accepted practice and guidance, and, you know, in areas such as subcutaneous infusions for symptom management, it's widely accepted internationally that this is an effective way and a safe way of treating patients for symptom management. The regulatory bodies and the professional bodies are accepting and endorse off-label and EMP prescribing as essential practices. But there does seem to be an increasing emphasis on the importance of the prescriber being well briefed of the evidence-based, so that we can balance the risk and benefit of potential treatment. And we just need to be extra cognizant, I suppose, of the information needs of patients. So how do we evolve then with palliative care and our use of EMPs and off-label medicines uses? I suppose there's probably other ideas out there and maybe conflicting ideas, but I suppose I've just said I put down some ideas as to how we might improve things for our patients, and try and develop, you know, just recognizing the potential negatives of off-label use. So sometimes looking at the consensus statements there, some of them are very old, they're from the UK mainly. So I think, you know, one thing that could be done even at European level is to kind of develop a consensus statement on best practice for use for off-label use. Another thing that could be done is to, you know, further develop patient information for medicines tailored to the off-label uses of medicines in palliative care, so that can be something that could be reached for then, where the packaging really doesn't explain to the patient, you know, what the medicine is for. I suppose it puts it up to us to grow the evidence base, to examine and audit patient outcomes of off-label use, maybe even on a case-by-case basis, and to, you know, write up our case studies where we're using something that we know there isn't, you know, a huge amount of evidence published for. You know, things like grading the evidence base can be very useful. And I think looking at what was done with the pharmacological management of cancer pain in adults, you know, every recommendation there has a kind of a standardized grading. And I think, you know, if we could do something like that, even for some of our smaller areas of practice, you know, this was a huge undertaking, and cancer pain is such a huge area, but, you know, being able to, you know, see what level of evidence is behind each medicine treatment in a certain area, I think is really useful. And it helps us balance the decision-making correctly, I think. Even things like potentially looking at our palliative meds info guidance documents and tailoring those, you know, putting some better, clearer graded recommendations in there, so it's clear, you know, sort of what level of recommendation it is. And then finally, perhaps documenting the risk-benefit considerations for individual patients when, you know, a decision is being made to prescribe off-label for something where, you know, there's limited evidence, or, you know, where the decision-making process is tricky. So they're just some ideas, I suppose, about how we can evolve with this and manage this potential, you know, the potential difficulties around this area. So that's it. Over to everyone for thoughts and discussion. And I just wanted to say a thank you to Dr. Bernadette Hanley, who shared her Grand Rounds presentation on this subject from January 2020 with me, and certainly helped me take a few shortcuts when researching this presentation. Thank you very much, everyone.